think about the last conversation you had.
Right.
Maybe it was with a coworker or, a family member or just the barista who handed you your morning coffee.
Yeah, everyday stuff.
Exactly. When you were speaking to them, did you consciously change the fundamental grammatical structure of your verbs based on who they were related to?
I'm gonna guess probably not.
Right. Probably not. I mean, if you're speaking English, or really most of the world's most widely spoken languages, you just don't have to. A verb is a verb.
It's very clinical.
It is. It's like an architectural blueprint. You put the subject here, the action word there, and boom, the sentence holds up the roof.
Yeah, it's highly transactional. We tend to view grammar as this, set of static rules.
Yeah.
You learn the rule, you apply the rule, and the language functions. It's comforting because it's so binary.
Right, exactly.
Yeah.
Broken or not broken, correct or incorrect. But what if we told you that there are languages where that rigid transactional blueprint just completely shatters?
Completely goes out the window.
Languages that don't just convey information, but actually scan the room like a social radar.
It's fascinating.
It really is. So welcome to the deep dive. We are so thrilled to have you here with us. And today we have this just genuinely fascinating stack of sources to guide us, anchored by extracts from a highly detailed, incredibly meticulous linguistic text called, and bear with me here, Mathili Samanantar Vyakaran Rachna a Bhashavagan.
It is a remarkable document. Really, it goes far beyond the standard textbook. It's this exhaustive documentation of a very specific, fiercely localized regional language known as Thethianjika.
Right. And that is our mission for you today. We aren't here to just, memorize where the commas go or how to conjugate a past participle.
Oh, definitely not.
We're going to use this grammar book as almost like a psychological decoder ring.
Mhm.
By the end of this deep dive, you're going to see how the literal structure of a language, like down to the vowels and the verbs, can reveal the entire history, the social dynamics, and the deeply ingrained culture of Eastern India.
It's a huge undertaking, but it's worth it.
Oh, absolutely. And just as a teaser, later on, we are going to explore a grammatical feature where the action word you use changes entirely based on whether the person you are talking to is connected to the person you were talking about.
Which is just wild to think about.
It's going to completely change how you view sentence structure. So we have our resident expert here to help synthesize all these linguistic building blocks. But where do we even begin to anchor this? Like, where are we?
Well, we have to start with the soil, really.
Mm.
You cannot understand a language without understanding the geography that forged it.
Right.
According to the source text, Thethianjika is spoken in a very specific belt of eastern India. So we're talking primarily about the states of Bihar and Jharkhand.
Okay.
And it spills over into parts of West Bengal, like Malda, and even creeping across the border into the southern plains of Nepal.
So we are talking about a massive, historically rich agricultural region, basically the Ganges River Basin.
Exactly. And the text specifically zeroes in on districts like Bhagalpur, Munger, and Begusarai.
Okay.
Now, if you look at ancient historical maps of the Indian subcontinent, like long before modern state lines were ever drawn, this specific territory was known as the Anga region.
Ah, so that's the root of the name, Enjika.
Yes, precisely. And the Thithi part, that essentially means pure or unadulterated, referring to the raw, colloquial, rural form of the speech.
Okay, so linguistically speaking, where does this fit into the grand family tree? Because I imagine it doesn't just, exist in a vacuum.
Oh, far from it. If we trace the lineage, it starts at the very top with the massive Indo-European family.
Which is huge.
Right, and incredibly, that links it distantly to languages like English and Spanish.
Wait, really? That's crazy.
Yeah, and from there, it branches down into Indo-Iranian, then Indo-Aryan, and finally it lands in a very specific cluster known as the Magadhi group.
Okay, so it's sitting at the dinner table with languages like Bhojpuri, Bajika, Maithili, Magahi, and Bengali. They are all sibling languages. But how do you tell where one ends and the other begins? Because having looked through the sources, the lines seem incredibly blurry.
Well, if we connect this to the bigger picture, it's crucial to rethink how language borders actually work in the real world.
What do you mean?
Well, in the West, we are often used to hard borders. You cross from France to Germany, and suddenly, boom, the language fundamentally changes.
Right, you're either speaking French or German.
Exactly.
Yeah.
But in this region of India, languages exist on a fluid continuum. Centuries ago, there was this ancient root tongue called Magadhi Apabhramsha, which was essentially a localized colloquial evolution of Sanskrit.
Like a street version of Sanskrit.
Yeah, exactly. And as communities settled along different bends of the rivers or across different valleys, that root language slowly fractured and adapted. So you don't just, cross the street in Bihar and hear a brand new language.
Yeah, it just kind of blends.
Right, the dialect just slowly gradients from Angika to Mathili to Bhojpuri as you travel west.
It's a linguistic gradient. But okay, here's something from the source that honestly made me laugh, and I feel like I have to push back on how academia has historically treated this language.
Oh, I think I know where you're going with this.
The text mentions that in 1903, the famous colonial linguist George Grierson was compiling his massive linguistic survey of India, right?
Yes, a very famous survey.
Right, and he categorized Tethyanchika basically as a subdialect of Maithili. But the kicker is he officially dubbed it the Chika-Chiki language.
Yes, the Chika-Chiki language.
And he called it that simply because the speakers heavily use the verb chaik, which means is.
Yeah, Grierson's survey is this monumental piece of historical linguistics, but his naming conventions could be remarkably literal.
But isn't that totally absurd? I mean, naming an ancient, deeply nuanced regional language after one single frequently used verb?
It is a bit on the nose.
It genuinely feels like, okay, imagine if aliens visited Earth, listened to us speak American English, noticed we say going to and want to constantly, and then officially documented us in the Galactic Archives as speakers of the Gunawana language.
The Gunawana language. That's actually a great comparison.
Right. It's so reductive. I mean, does the academic community still actually use that term?
It is reductive, and you're entirely right to challenge it. But it really highlights a massive historical problem in early colonial linguistics.
How so?
Well, you have an outsider, a British official, in Grierson's case, coming into an incredibly complex localized ecosystem. Their foreign ear catches onto the most repetitive, phonetically distinct sounds.
So it just sticks out to them.
Exactly. To Grierson, hearing chaik all the time stood out sharply against standard Hindi, so he slapped a catchy, basically onomatopoeic label on it.
Wow.
The local people, of course, recognized themselves as speakers of Angika, or Thethi. They didn't call their own language Chika-Chiki.
Obviously not.
But because Grierson wrote it down in an official, imperially funded survey, it became the academic shorthand for decades. It perfectly illustrates how external observation can just brutally oversimplify internal complexity.
It's a great reminder to always question who holds the pen when history is being written, for sure. But you mentioned his ear catching on to distinct sounds, which I think is a perfect bridge into how this language actually physically operates in the mouth.
The phonetics, yes.
Yeah, the source text has an extensive breakdown of the phonetics, the varn and akshar, the vowels and consonants. And right away, there is a specific vowel that acts as a giant neon sign distinguishing Tethyanchika from standard Hindi.
Yes, the dominant phonetic signature of the language. It utilizes a very specific throat-based O sound.
Right, and in the script, it's written as war.
Exactly. It's this deep guttural resonance that shapes almost the entirety of the spoken rhythm.
The source describes it almost like a physical anchor for the language. But why? Okay, let's unpack this. People don't just wake up one generation and decide to start speaking from the back of their throats instead of the front of their mouths, right?
No, of course not. Phonetic shifts are almost always driven by long-term environmental or sociological factors.
Okay.
Linguists refer to sounds like this deep O as velar or guttural sounds. They're produced way back near the soft palate.
Right.
And when we look at the mechanics of why a specific regional community adopts a sound like this, it often comes down to the principle of least effort, or basically ease of articulation.
Wait, you're saying the language evolved this way because the speakers were just looking for a shortcut? Are you calling them lazy?
No, not laziness. Biological efficiency.
Okay.
Think about a highly agrarian society living in a hot, humid climate, deeply embedded in physical labor. In tight-knit, isolated communities where everyone shares the exact same context, you just don't need to hyper-enunciate every single syllable to be understood.
Ah, I see.
The throat-based O is a highly efficient way to transition between the specific, heavy consonants they use. It actually requires slightly less intricate muscle movement in the lips and the tip of the tongue.
That's fascinating.
Over centuries, the language naturally settled into this deeper, more resonant groove because it was physically easier for that specific community to sustain while working.
That makes a lot of sense. It's like water finding the path of least resistance down a mountain. And speaking of, like, phonetic shortcuts, the text highlights an amazing consonant shift, too.
Right, the she sounds.
Yeah. It notes that the she sounds, like in the English words shoe or sharp, are almost entirely abandoned in Tetiangika. They just replace them with a simple S sound, so an she just becomes an S.
Exactly. The she is what we call the fricative sound. It requires you to round your lips slightly, lift the blade of your tongue to the roof of your mouth, and push a sustained stream of air.
That is a lot of work when you break it down like that.
It is. Whereas an S just requires you to let air hiss over your teeth. It's a simplification. If the distinction between Shirog and Ez isn't strictly necessary to distinguish between two vital words, the language just drops the harder sound.
Efficiency wins again.
Yeah.
But my favorite phonetic quirk in this entire source text, and honestly the one that feels the most relatable, is a phenomenon the text calls viparai. It translates roughly to inversion or swapping. The text documents how speakers frequently just flip their L and R sounds.
Yes. Liquid consonant interchange. It's a really fascinating linguistic trait.
The source gives the example of the word for river, which in standard Hindi or Sanskrit might be nadi.
Right.
In the local dialect, it morphs into nadi, but then the speakers apply the swap and it ends up as ladi.
Exactly.
Or take a common local lentil known broadly as rahari. In Tetiangika, it becomes lahari. Is this just a localized error? Because it reminds me of regional accents in English, like how someone from Boston might completely drop an R, or someone might say nuclear instead of nuclear.
It's exactly like that. And it is crucial to understand that it is absolutely not an error.
Okay.
Phonetically, L and R are incredibly close cousins. They are both alveolar liquids.
Meaning what exactly?
Meaning your tongue hits almost the exact same spot right behind your top teeth to make both sounds. Try it. LR.
LR. Yeah, they are really close.
In many languages globally, these two sounds blur together or are entirely interchangeable.
So if a standardized grammar teacher from New Delhi came down to Bhagalpur, they might hear Lahari instead of Rahari and try to correct it.
They very well might try, but they would be linguistically wrong to do so. The source text isn't a book of corrections, it's a book of documentation.
I love that distinction.
What this teaches us is that proper pronunciation is an illusion, dictated mostly by whoever holds cultural power. Within the Anga region, Lahari is not a mispronunciation. It is the correct, standardized regional evolution of the word.
The environment shaped the sound?
Exactly. And the sound is perfectly tailored to the people using it.
I just love how democratizing that is. The language belongs to the people speaking it, not to a textbook in some distant capital. So, okay, we have these unique sounds, the guttural O, the hissing S, the fluid swapping of L's and R's, and obviously sounds combine to build words.
Naturally.
But this is where the source completely shattered my expectations of how nouns are supposed to work. Because in Tetiangika, words don't just exist as static labels, they come in different sizes.
Yes, the morphological sizes. This is where we really begin to see the deep social psychology of the region bleeding into the actual construction of the vocabulary.
Before we get to how the sizes actually work, the source categorizes where the vocabulary comes from in the first place, which I found super helpful.
Oh, the 4 buckets?
Yeah. It breaks word origins down into 4 buckets. You have tatsam, which are pure, unmodified Sanskrit words.
The ancient stuff.
Right. Then tadpav, which are Sanskrit words that have naturally eroded and changed over time. Then there are agut words, which are foreign borrowings from Arabic, Persian, or even English, like calling a school an iskul.
Very common in South Asian languages, yeah.
But the 4th bucket is easily the most fascinating to me.
The Deshaj words, the local soil words.
Yes, words that have zero etymological connection to High Sanskrit or foreign invaders. They literally just sprouted out of the local dirt. The text gives examples like gutru or batru to refer to a child. It just sounds so earthy and visceral.
It does. Deshaj translates roughly to born of the country. These words are the linguistic fingerprints of the indigenous culture.
Right.
They almost always describe the immediate, tactile realities of rural life. So, specific farming tools, highly localized flora and fauna, intimate family nicknames.
Stuff the scholars in the cities wouldn't even know about.
Exactly. Because these concepts were so hyper-local, the high Sanskrit vocabulary of the elite scholars simply didn't have words for them, or the local people just didn't have access to the Sanskrit. So they invented their own vocabulary. It's language grown from the ground up.
Okay, so keeping that earthy, socially grounded reality in mind, let's look at the size phenomenon, because the source outlines that nouns uniquely have three physical forms.
Yes, this is brilliant.
They call them short, which is lagu, long, which is guru, and extra, which is atarikt.
Lagu guru atarikt.
Let me give the example from the text so we can ground this. If
Yeah.
you have a person named Fudan, that is the short form. If you want to make it long, you say Fudna. And to make it extra, you say Fudanma.
Right.
Or take a profession, like a gardener, which is Mali. It stretches to Malia and then expands even further to Maliba.
Yes.
It's literally like ordering coffee sizes. You've got your tall, your grande, and your venti nouns. But, and this is the crazy part, you aren't ordering more syllables just for fun. You are ordering entirely different levels of emotional and social weight.
Exactly. What's fascinating here is that manipulating the physical length of a word dictates the emotional and social intimacy between the speaker and the subject.
Okay, break that down for us.
Well, in English, if you want to convey intimacy or disrespect, you rely heavily on adjectives or tone of voice.
Right.
You might say, "Oh, my dearest friend John," or you might roll your eyes and say, "Ugh, that guy John."
Right, but John is just John.
Exactly. The noun John never changes. But in Sethianjika, you alter the architecture of the noun itself. The text explains that adding the "ia" suffix to make it listening. Longso Mali becoming Malia can swing wildly in two directions based on context.
How so?
It can signal deep, intense affection, like a mother talking affectionately to a child. Or conversely, it can signal a profound lack of respect, putting someone firmly beneath you in the social hierarchy.
So if I'm angry at my gardener, I don't just yell at him. I actually morph his title from Mali to Malia to grammatically put him in his place.
Yes, the grammar enforces the hierarchy.
Oh, wow.
And then you have the extra form, adding wa or ba. So Malia becomes Maliba, or Asari becoming Sadiba.
What does that do?
This usually denotes a highly specific, pointed version of that thing. It's not just any gardener. It is that specific gardener we both know, with all the historical baggage attached to him.
It's incredibly efficient, but also think about the cognitive load on the speaker.
Oh, it's massive.
If I'm speaking English, I just use your name. But if I'm speaking Thithi-Anjika, before I even say your name, my brain has to rapidly calculate, do I like you? Do I respect you? Are you my elder? Are you my subordinate? And then I have to physically stretch the word to match that calculation. It's social navigation disguised as morphology.
That's a great way to put it. It demands a high baseline of social intelligence. You cannot be socially oblivious and speak this language correctly. You have to constantly read the relationship and codify it in the syllable count.
Which is the perfect pivot to our next question. Because if the mere length of a word defines social intimacy, how does the language handle physical space?
Ah, yes. Space and crowds.
Right, we've seen how they navigate single nouns, but the source text dives into pronouns and adjectives next, and it paints a picture of a society that is hyper-aware of its surroundings.
This is where we see a deeply collective, spatially anchored mindset really begin to imprint itself on the rules of grammar.
Let's start with pluralization, because this blew my mind. The source notes that gender is fairly standard. It's a binary masculine and feminine, often modified with an I suffix.
Yes, like chotka, meaning a small boy, becomes choki for a small girl.
Right, simple enough. But making something plural is entirely different from what we are used to. In English, we usually just slap an S on the end of a word. One car, two cars, one man, two men.
Right, an internal vowel shift or a simple suffix.
But in the Thithi-Anjika, the text points out that you don't just change the noun itself, you actually append a whole crowd word to it.
Yes, words like sab, log, and sini.
So if you want to talk about multiple men, you don't just conjugate the word for man, which is admi. You have to say admi sini. It literally translates to man crowd or man group.
And think about the sociological implications of that.
Yeah.
How do you conceptualize many? By pluralizing through literally attaching the word for people or group, the language forces the speaker to visualize the collective.
It's not just a bunch of individuals.
Exactly. You aren't just seeing 5 disconnected individual men standing near each other. The grammar requires you to see them as a unified entity. A log or a sab.
It's like how in English we say a murder of crows or a school of fish to denote a collective animal group, but we rarely apply that rigid collective structure to everyday human objects or standard people.
Right, we're very individualistic in our grammar. But this reveals a worldview where the group identity, the collective mass, is fundamentally more grammatically significant than the isolated individual.
Wow.
It's a society deeply reliant on communal living, shared agriculture, and extended family networks. The grammar just mirrors the lifestyle perfectly.
And that anchoring to reality extends to physical space, too, doesn't it?
Oh, absolutely.
The text details the pronouns the sarvnam and highlights that there are entirely distinct forms depending on whether the person you are talking about is physically near you or far away from you.
Yes, distance matters.
If a person is close, you use I or E. If they are far away, like across the field or down the road, you use you.
Spatial orientation is baked into the very identification of the person. You literally cannot refer to someone without acknowledging where they are in relation to your own physical body.
This raises a massive question for me about how this language shapes the brain. I mean, if I constantly have to calculate if you are near me or far from me, just to say the equivalent of the word he or she, wouldn't I become hyper-aware of my physical environment?
Absolutely you would. There is a whole branch of cognitive linguistics that studies this exact phenomenon. When a language forces you to constantly calculate and state spatial relationships, your brain develops an exceptional, almost subconscious compass.
So you always know where you are.
You are deeply anchored to your environment. You aren't just floating in an abstract conversation. You are always the geographic center point of the dialogue, and everyone else is defined by their physical distance from you.
And it's not just physical distance, it's social distance again, right?
Yes, they combine the two.
The text notes that these pronouns are layered with honorifics, so a standard he might be you. But if it's a deeply respected elder, you use huni or hunhi.
So in real time, the speaker is calculating where is this person physically, near or far, and where is this person socially, equal, lower, or worthy of deep respect.
It's exhausting just thinking about it.
And they must choose the exact right pronoun to satisfy both those axes simultaneously.
It's constant social and spatial math. And even the adjectives and numbers do this. The source notes that when they count objects, they don't just use abstract numbers, they attach numeric counters to the number itself.
Yes, words like ta, go, or tho.
So 1 isn't just eek, it's ekta. 2 is do go. It's almost as if they refuse to let a number exist as a floating, abstract concept. It has to be physically tethered to an object in the real world.
That is the perfect way to summarize it. Everything is tethered. The numbers are tethered to physical objects, the plurals are tethered to collective crowds, the pronouns are tethered to physical space and social hierarchy. Thethi Angika is a language that utterly refuses to let you exist in isolation.
Which brings us to the absolute mechanical heart of this deep dive. Because if you thought the nouns and pronouns were doing heavy lifting, just wait until we look at the verbs.
The verbs are incredible.
Because this is where the language goes from being fascinating to being borderline telepathic.
The verb is the engine of any sentence. But in this language, it's an engine equipped with a highly sophisticated social sensor array.
Here's where it gets really interesting. The source text dedicates a significant portion to the verbs, which they call kriya. And yes, they change based on tense and, past, present, future, first person, second person. That's standard.
Right, standard verb stuff.
But then it introduces a phenomenon that is completely alien to English speakers. It's called Shrota Samban, listener relationship.
This is undoubtedly the crown jewel of Thethi Angika grammar. It is a feature that leaves most foreign linguists stunned.
Okay, let me try to explain this clearly based on the text because it really broke my brain at first. The rule is this. The verb conjugation, like the actual letters that make up the action word you were speaking, changes entirely depending on whether the person you are talking to has a relationship with the person you are talking about.
Yes. The listener's relationship to the subject dictates the speaker's verb.
Let's build a hypothetical scenario using the exact example from the source text. Say, I want to ask a very simple question. He ate. In English, he ate is completely static. I can ask you if your brother ate. I can ask you if the president ate. I can ask you if a random guy on the street ate. The words he ate never change.
Right. English ignores the social web.
Completely. But in Thethi Angika, if I am talking to you and the he we are discussing is your brother, someone you are directly connected to, I would ask ukailkau. The verb is kailkau.
Right. Because it acknowledges the tether between you, the listener, and him, the subject.
But if we are looking out the window and I want to ask if a completely random, unconnected guy on the street just ate his lunch, I would ask, kailkai, kailkai.
Yes, the unconnected verb.
The verb entirely changes from kailkau to kailkai simply because you don't know the guy on the street. English does not care about the listener's relationship to a third party. This is like 3D linguistic chess. How does a speaker even process this in real time?
Let's unpack the profound psychological implications of this because it is staggering. Think about what this grammar demands of you before you even open your mouth.
Yeah.
Before I can finish my sentence, before I can choose the final verb to describe an action, my brain has to rapidly run a diagnostic check. Who am I talking to? Who am I talking about? And what is the invisible social tether between those two people?
You literally have to know the town gossip just to conjugate a verb correctly. You have to know who is connected to who, what happens you get it wrong, does it cause offense?
It absolutely can. If I use kail kai, the unconnected verb, to talk about your brother, I am grammatically severing your family tie.
Oh, wow.
I am implying he is a stranger to you. It would sound jarring, perhaps even insulting. The grammar forces the speaker to constantly, actively acknowledge the social network of the person standing in front of them. It weaves a web of empathy and social awareness directly into the syntax of mundane conversation.
That is just beautiful. Did he eat? Stops being a mere request for data. It becomes, I acknowledge that he is your brother, I validate your connection to him, and because I respect that connection, I am asking, did he eat? All of that subtext is packed into the single word kalika.
It builds a highly cohesive community. Every time you speak, you are reaffirming the community's relational map.
And the incredible nuance in the verbs doesn't stop with the listener. The source highlights another massive distinction, this time regarding the concept of existence itself.
Ah, yes. It breaks down the difference between the words chai and chaik.
The existential versus the definitive. This is where rural grammar touches high philosophy.
The text gives a great example. Chai implies mere existence or location. So if I say, there is water in the glass, I use chai. The water happens to be existing there right now.
Okay, got it.
But chaik implies absolute identity or definition. If I point to the glass and say, this is water and nothing else, I use chaik. It's asserting essence.
And in English, we rely on the overwork word is for both scenarios. The water is in the glass, which is location, and this liquid is water, which is identity.
Right. Is does all the heavy lifting.
The Theanjika separates these concepts at the root anatomical level of the language. It allows a farmer or a merchant to express incredible philosophical precision in everyday speech without needing complex vocabulary. The philosophy is built into the basic verbs.
So we have nouns that stretch like accordions based on respect, pronouns that map out physical distance, and verbs that track the invisible social webs between everyone in the village.
It's a lot to keep track of.
It is. And to hold all of these incredibly complex, highly fluid elements together, the language must need some seriously strong linguistic glue. Otherwise, it would just fall apart into chaos.
It does need glue. And that structural glue is what the source text meticulously outlines when it discusses indeclinables and the rigid rules of sentence formulation.
The text refers to these indeclinables as avayas. And the definition is wonderfully simple. These are words that refuse to change.
They are the anchors.
Right. They don't care about gender. They don't care about plurals. They don't care if you are talking to your brother or a stranger. They are the fixed, concrete pillars in the sentence. But even within these fixed pillars, the language reveals a fascinating cultural rhythm, specifically regarding time.
This is a detail that genuinely exposes the historical heartbeat of the people.
The source notes that Thetheanjika completely separates the concept of time of day from the concept of days of the week. It's so unique that the text explicitly points out that Standard Hindi doesn't even make this distinction.
No, it doesn't.
If you want to talk about a specific hour or moment, like at that time, you must use words like akni or takni. But if you want to talk about a specific day, like on that day, you have to use entirely different words, jahiya or tahiya.
Let's connect this to the bigger picture.
Mm-hmm.
Why would a language strictly wall off hours from days?
Yeah, why? I mean, an hour is just a fraction of a day. Why treat them like two alien concepts?
Because of agrarian survival. In a farming society reliant on manual labor and livestock, the time of day, the akni or takni, is the realm of urgent, immediate labor.
Right, the sun is moving.
The sun is setting. It is time to milk the cows right now. The heat is peaking. It is time to seek shade right now. Hourly time is immediate action. But the day, the jahiya or tahiya, belongs to the broader, slower cycles of life.
The seasons.
The changing of the seasons, the alignment of the harvest, the weekly market days, the religious festivals. By grammatically walling them off from each other, the language acknowledges that human beings exist in two different streams of time, the urgent present and the cyclical seasons.
Wow. And practically speaking, it is incredibly precise. It completely eliminates the ambiguity we constantly fight in English.
Oh, absolutely.
If I say to you, I'll do it then, you might have to ask, do you mean at 3 p.m. today or do you mean next Thursday? In English, then is sloppy. In Thetheanjika, the specific word I choose instantly tells you if I mean a time on the clock or a day on the calendar.
It prioritizes clarity. And that demand for clarity, that structural rigidity, extends to how they build entire sentences, or vakya.
Yes, the source text gets very clinical here. It notes that sentences follow logical structures, simple, mixed, compound. But to be considered a valid, intelligible sentence, the text outlines 3 uncompromising, strict requirements. It's not enough just to string words together.
The 3 pillars of a sentence, yogyata, akanksha, and asakti.
Let's break these down because it feels like the language is demanding a mathematical proof before it allows you to speak. First is yogyata, which translates to mutual compatibility. The text explains that the words must logically fit together in reality.
Exactly. You cannot say he watered the plants with fire. Grammatically, it has a subject, a verb, and an object. In English, it is a perfectly formulated sentence, even if it's nonsensical.
Right, we can say nonsense all day long.
But in the logic of Thethi and Jika structure, it lacks yogyata. Water and fire are incompatible with the action of nourishing a plant. The sentence is structurally invalid because it violates reality.
That is wild. The grammar enforces reality. Okay. Second is akanksha, which means necessity or expectancy. The sentence must fulfill its own thought. It can't leave you hanging with an incomplete idea that leaves the listener guessing.
It must be totally self-contained and satisfying.
And the third is asakti, which means proximity. The words that relate to each other have to be spoken close together in time. You can't say the subject, pause for a minute to drink tea, and then say the verb.
So why does a language that is so fluid and emotional with its nouns and verbs suddenly become so incredibly strict and draconian about its sentence structure?
That's exactly what I was wondering. It feels like a massive contradiction.
It's a necessary counterbalance. Because the nouns are constantly shape-shifting to denote respect, and the verbs are constantly changing based on who knows whom, the potential for confusion is massive.
Oh, I see.
If the structure of the sentence wasn't absolutely rigid and logical, the whole complex social web would collapse into noise. The rigid rules, the yogyata and akanksha, are the strong, concrete foundation that allows the beautiful, socially nuanced vocabulary to dance without falling over.
That's a brilliant way to look at it. The rules exist specifically to allow for safe, culturally rich expression, which brings us perfectly to the climax of this source text: cultural expression through idioms, proverbs, and literature.
This is my favorite part.
Because once you understand the machinery, you can finally appreciate the art it produces.
This is where the skeletal structure of the grammar puts on flesh and blood.
The source makes a really helpful distinction right out of the gate between a muhavara, which is an idiom, and a lokakti, which is a proverb.
Right.
It explains that an idiom usually just has an implied meaning and forms a fragment of a sentence, like saying someone spilled the beans. But a lokakti, a proverb, is a full, complete, structurally sound sentence that is deeply rooted in local historical folk experience.
Proverbs are the crystallized wisdom of a community. If you want to know what a culture truly values, what they deeply fear, and how they navigate power, you don't look at their laws, you look at their proverbs.
Well, let's decode a few of the specific lokaktis provided in the text because they paint a very vivid picture. The first one is widely known in the region: Jekro lathi okre bains. Translated literally, it means whoever has the stick owns the buffalo.
This raises an important question. What does this specific imagery tell us about the historical realities of the Anga region?
Honestly, it sounds rough. It doesn't sound like a utopian village where everyone shares. It sounds like a place where might makes right, and if you can't defend what's yours, you lose it.
That is exactly the reality it reflects. The stick and buffalo proverb points to a historically rugged, power-based agrarian society. In that context, the buffalo is the ultimate symbol of wealth, sustenance, and life.
And the stick.
The stick is physical force, dominance, or political power. It's a stark, highly unsentimental worldview. Notice what the proverb doesn't say.
What do you mean?
It doesn't say the most righteous person gets the buffalo. It doesn't say the hardest worker gets it or the most pious. The one with the stick gets it, period. It is pragmatic survivalism passed down across generations as linguistic wisdom.
It's brutal, but it's honest. Here's another one. Chatman, bad bait. Smallmouth, big talk.
Ah, a classic universal warning against breaking the established social hierarchy.
Right, it instantly reminds me of the noun sizes we talked about earlier.
Exactly. It implies that people of lower status or younger age, the smallmouth, should not presume to speak authoritatively on matters above their station, the big talk.
It reinforces the structure.
It culturally enforces the exact same social order that we saw mapped out in the short and long nouns and the near and far pronouns. The grammar and the culture are reinforcing each other in a loop.
And the third proverb, the text highlights Japautai sukatai, whoever gets it will eat it, or whoever finds it will use it. It's basically the equivalent of finders keepers, but again with a very earthy, visceral, survivalist edge.
It speaks to a society where resources might historically be scarce. In times of drought or famine, abstract laws of ownership matter less than immediate possession. Possession is the ultimate law.
So what does this all mean? Why spend an hour dissecting guttural vowels and proverbs about buffaloes? The source text wraps up its massive analysis by discussing the concept of word power, or Shabd Shakti.
Right, the power of words.
It theorizes that a word doesn't just have one function. It can have a literal dictionary meaning, which it calls abhida. It can have an implied contextual meaning, lakshana, or it can hold a deeply hidden, resonant, almost poetic meaning, vyanjana.
Yes, the layers of meaning.
It even briefly touches on how, despite being viewed as a rural or colloquial language, Thethi Anjika is fully capable of sustaining complex poetry, utilizing strict meter, deep emotion, and ornamentation as the absolute peak of its structural capability.
What the author is ultimately arguing is that the grammar we've been analyzing isn't just a set of constraints meant to hold people back. It's a highly sophisticated toolkit.
That makes sense.
The strict rules about verbs matching the listener, the temporal markers dividing days from hours, the rigid sentence structure that is just the skeletal frame, the proverbs, the vivid idioms, the hidden poetic meanings, that is the beautiful, earthy cultural muscle built on top of that frame. You absolutely need those rigid linguistic bones to support the heavy, beautiful weight of the literature and the lived experience.
It really has been an incredible journey through this text today. We set out to use a grammar book as a psychological decoder for a region, and I think we found exactly that. We started with the physical sounds, discovering that the dropping of the sh and the fluid swapping of the L and R sounds isn't a mistake, but proof that local pronunciation is shaped by efficiency and environment. It is its own correct standard.
We moved into the morphology, exploring the emotional sizing of words, where simply adding a suffix like ia or by acts like a volume dial, letting the speaker instantly broadcast affection, disrespect, or laser-focused specificity.
We looked at the deeply collective worldview baked into how they pluralize, literally attaching a crowd to a noun rather than letting it stand alone. We marveled at the incredible, almost telepathic social awareness of the verbs, where the speaker must constantly track the invisible web of relationships between the listener and the subject just to ask a simple question. And we ended with the rich, pragmatic, sometimes beautifully harsh wisdom of the local proverbs.
It is a language that simply refuses to let you sleepwalk through a conversation. It demands that you pay acute attention to the people around you, the physical space you occupy, and the passage of time in both immediate hours and cyclical seasons.
It really brings us back to that idea of the grammatical blueprint we started with. We thought we were looking at a rigid, binary set of rules. But the grammar of Thethi Anjika isn't a blueprint for a building. It is a living, breathing map of a community's soul. Which leaves me with a final thought, something for you to mull over as we wrap up this deep dive.
A provocative question to take out into the world.
Exactly. We've seen how this language forces you, through its very verbs, to constantly acknowledge the social connections of the person standing right in front of you. You literally cannot speak without validating their relationships. So the question is, does speaking a language like that make a society fundamentally more empathetic because you are constantly aware of everyone's human ties? Or, on the flip side, does it just ruthlessly enforce a strict social hierarchy, trapping you in a web of obligations and status that you can never grammatically escape? Does language shape our empathy, or does our innate empathy shape our language?
It is the ultimate chicken and egg question of linguistics, sociology, and human nature.
It really is. Thank you for joining us on this deep dive into these incredible sources. We hope that the next time you speak, you listen a little more closely to the hidden rules, the spatial math, and the emotional sizes of the words in your own native language. There is always a whole world hiding right beneath the syllables. Until next time, keep diving deep.